Okay, so before we'll make it from scratch, and what we'll actually use is a free program called Materialize to make these textures. So we'll be starting with just a simple texture, this thing, which is just painted in Photoshop, a really basic texture. You can see it's got a grainy noise underneath, and it's got these blobs painted out over it, and we can use that to create a pretty realistic looking orange. But really, like I said, what matters, or the point of this exercise, is that we're getting all of the extra details through texture maps. So it's by a company, Bounding Box Software, and you can just go to the downloads page and grab it. You can kind of see from their demo what it does. Like, I don't know if that picture's going to enlarge for me, but it makes a wide range of maps based on an input picture. So like here, for example, they've just taken a photo of this sort of manhole cover sewer grate thing, and then by plugging in or pressing the button to convert to these different types of materials, it makes all of these other texture maps, which then when you plug in to your renderer, whether that's Arnold or Redshift inside of Maya, or maybe a game engine, or you're using a completely different 3D program, but these texture maps can make a whole lot of detail for you. So you'll need to jump on here and download Materialize for Windows, and I'll give you just a really quick rundown of how to use it. I'm literally I'm using it in a pretty basic way. I'm just plugging in a color map, which is diffuse, and then converting that to a couple of the other maps. So the first thing is to load in a map. So the little O is open. What I'm going to do before I start is in Maya, I'll just jump back and make a brand new scene, and let's make a new project. So I'll just go new project, project window, and new, because this is the second one. I'm going to call it Orange 02, accept. And so now I'm copying the files that I shared with you earlier, the two textures, the floor and the orange texture. And you can see, I'll just show you my window. So I've got, this is the Maya project that I literally just created. And in my source images, I'm going to just paste those two textures that I've downloaded. So this is where you want to be at the start of this tutorial. Just make a brand new project, and you definitely need to use a project for this to work, because we're using a bunch of different texture maps. So you really can't get away anymore with just saving your scene to anywhere, because it's connecting to a bunch of different images. So in my scenes file, just in case you can't remember how projects work, so this is the project that I just created by going File, Project Window, and clicking New Project. And now if I save my scene, by default it's looking in that location, and I can click on Scenes, which takes me to that route. I recommend using ASCII as the best format, and we'll call this, doesn't really matter what you call it, but always use 01, 02, 03, etc. So incremental save. So I'm going to click O for open and find my, where did I put it? Drives, remember where I saved. Okay, so in my project, and I'll put it into source images, and we'll start with the floor, because it's simple. So I'm going to select it, and it'll load it into the diffuse. Materialize doesn't give you any indicator that it's thinking, so just be aware of that. When you go to load something, it looks like it's frozen. Just give it a second and it usually works fine. This feels similar to most 3D things we've used, so it's just right click to orbit and middle click to pan and roll in to zoom. And I'm not going to finesse over this too much. I just want to show you the basics, and you can finesse if you want. So at the moment we're just looking at a 2D picture. It's bitmap, basic pixels. And what I want to do is create these other maps. Now you'll notice that some have the word create and some don't, and that's because the maps that have the word create can use just the existing maps loaded to create what they need. So basically creating a height map from a diffuse map is really simple, because it's just dropping all the color and giving you sliders to adjust the grayscale. It's just a grayscale version of a diffuse map, really, but with some of the saturation removed. Whereas a normal map is a bit more complex and it can't create that just from this, but once you've loaded a few more, it will give you the option. So I'm going to go straight to height map and just click create. If you zoom in, you can see a slider there. It's showing you the original and what it's making from the height map. So I can change that, and then your standard settings. You can muck around with all these settings. It's got presets. Like I said, I'm not going to muck around too much, but you can kind of get a sense for what it does, how that's working. Now I'm just going to pick a random value and set as a height map. And what I can do is click, now that I've got two maps, I can go show fill material. And what's actually showing me is a pretty close, it's going to depend on my render settings in Maya, but it's showing me a pretty good idea of what the final thing's going to look like once rendered. So it's basically showing me a height map, and you can see now it's got 2 dimensions. And what's nice about that is that I can then go, well, I've really set that ridiculously high, like that's super bumpy, the floor's not meant to look like that. So I can just come back to my height map and basically say, let's just play with the settings and try something else. So I probably want that pretty subtle, but I want the fine grain. Let's just try it a lot more subtle than what I had it before and see how that looks. And I can say show for material, and so it's clearly much more subtle now, and we're only seeing a slight bend in the settings. Again, in Maya, I can just tell it to increase the strength of the height generation or decrease it. But it's kind of nice that I don't have to just make a map, export it, set it up in Maya, render it, look at it in Maya and go, no, that's not working, and then jump back to my program to change it, which is what you would need to do in Photoshop, right? If you were just turning this into this, which you could totally do just with some Photoshop filters, adjustment passes, it's going to be pretty painful going back and forth. So this is really nice that I can just quickly do this. And you'll see now that I've made a height map, it's given me the option to make a normal map if I want. But like I said, we're going to skip over normal maps for today. I want to talk about the theory a little bit about that before we jump into normal maps. All I'm going to do then is height map, diffuse map, and I'll add a metal. So go to create a metallic map, and basically this will just be our specular. Specular color is all I'm going to use it for. And I can probably blur it a little. Not too worried. It's a demo. I'm not trying to make a perfect orange and floor for a client or something. So I just want you to understand the concept and set as metallic. So when I click set, it adds it in there. So I've got my 3 maps that I care about. Some of these other ones can be useful, but this is probably the main stuff. And even though we're looking at Substance Painter in more detail later, this sort of thing is really useful if all you want to do is like a quick stage. So remember, for the project, the prop that you're making for assignment 2 should be should be presented well. So just simply sticking on a floor like I'm doing now and then doing a nice render is going to look so much better than if it's just floating in space. So now that I've made my texture maps, I can click show for material, and it's just showing me all 3, and I do have settings to adjust how it's rendering in here, but I don't really care. I've got the output I want. To actually export this out, what you want to do is save the project. So I'll just show you my folder. So let's put it into images. So empty images folder in my project, my Maya project. And back to Materialize, we'll just go save project. And let's stick it in images. I probably should put it in source images actually. Doesn't really matter. As long as you can tell Maya where it is. And name it. So this one's floor. Whoops. I might just go 01. I like to put those incremental names in case I change something, and hit select. And if we take a look at what it's done, source images, it's made this MTZ file, which is our Materialize project, so I can reload that if I want to change it, and it's converted this into these 3 images. So now I've got these images in here. So let's do the same with the orange. I'm going to clear all texture maps, yes, I'm sure. Open, so open a diffuse map. I want the orange. It's thinking. I'm going to create a height map. I kind of want that fairly strong, I think. Let's just take a look. So I'm going to click set as height map and then show the material, and that's pretty strong. But what's nice about a height map is it's very easy to turn it down. You have to turn it down quite a lot anyway. The standard, like when set to 100% strength in Maya, is ridiculously strong. So you usually set it to like 0.001 or something. So I'm okay with that. I'm thinking more about just, is it definitely clearly working, even rather than does it look good. It's probably a touch strong, but that's fine. Let's create a metallic map, which I'm using as a specular. So metallic, not seeing too much there, so I definitely want to do something to get that shining through a bit more. And the lighter colours are what I'm concerned about. So I want the shininess on the outside of the orange, and in the little sort of divots, I want those to be darker because that'll make them less shiny. So other way, there we go. Let's try something like that. I feel like I've probably overdone that a bit, but let's just take a look. Set as metallic, show material. It's not super obvious, but you can see how, you can kind of see there's a bit of, when I move it around, that real shiny reflection is, it's very shiny over the surface, but it's not very shiny in those little holes, which is basically what I was going for. If I was concerned about how this looked, I'd definitely tweak this a bit more, but being a demo, that's sufficient. And so let's export this, so save project, and this one's orange. Just checking, so that's, yep, that's all appeared in here. So I've got, that's how I've generated my materials. So I'm done with Materialize. And we've got a new scene in Maya. So let's quickly just set up a stage so that we've got something to render. So I'm going to make a plane, and this will be our wooden floorboards. So what I'll do is just quickly throw in a camera. Might make that plane a bit bigger. I'm going to look through the camera and just position it, something like that, fairly close to the object. That'll do. It's probably a little bit angled actually, I wouldn't mind it a little bit more. Maybe something like that. Give it some light, so we're using Arnold. So just let's give it one big area light above it. I'll just rotate this face straight down, nice and large, so that just fills up the whole thing with light. And because I've scaled it up, I'm guessing I'm going to need this to be somewhere around maybe 3000 strength. And that can stay white, and I'm going to Control D to duplicate another one. I want to change its shape so I get a little bit of interesting shape out of it. I'll look through it and just angle this something like that. And I don't know, let's try 1000, let's try 2000. And I might give it a bit of color. It's always nice to get some color in your scene. What I'd like to do is go one, basically use opposing colors. So I'll have one quite warm on one side and one cool on the other, but subtle. So just a little bit of yellow. And Control D to duplicate that again. Straight away I'll just change the color to the opposite, so from yellow to blue for a cooler color. Again, very subtle, so not too ridiculous. And I will decrease this even further. Let's just try 1000. Just trying numbers, we'll have to do a render to know if it works. And then angle it, so look through selected, spin it around. And I'm just going the other side of this light and maybe a bit lower, something like this. And maybe I'll tweak the size of that object a little bit, the shape of it. The floor, I might even scale it up just to make sure it's all in frame. Let's give it a material, so holding down the right mouse, new material. So using Arnold, so AI standard surface. And at the moment we should have nothing. I'll just save it. I always like to save before I render, so Control S. So that's my starting scene, and let's just take a look if it renders. So open up the render view, that's my last render, and if I just right click in here and go camera 1, we'll see what we've got, and we should just be seeing a big white floor and maybe a little bit of fade off, but hard to know if we're looking at anything. So let's add a couple of, well, one sphere, so this will become our orange when we're ready. I'm just going to, what I might do actually is hit D to edit the pivot and just click on that vert right down the bottom. Maybe zoom in a bit, just on that, and then hit D to turn off edit pivot. So now my pivot point's right underneath, and also what I'll do is turning the grid back on, so I'm just checking the grid is aligned with this floor. So now if I turn on snap to grid, what I can do is move this down, it's going to be exactly on the floor. So I can move this pivot point and it's just going to snap exactly where I want it. So I'll position it roughly in front of the camera. What happened there? And then let's look through the camera and just put it into frame and maybe scale it down, I just want to be able to see it. That'll do, so at least there's something in the shot. I'm just going to check my resolution too. I think it's set to 540 by default, HD 540, yep. Okay, let's do another render. Bit hard to see, but just because everything's white and everything is really, really bright. So that's why the first thing you want to do when you set up your renders is just figure out what you need to do to make it look good, so you can see it and it's working. So I'll turn this right down to 1000, and that's taking a little while to render. I'm just going to quickly re-render this little chunk. So if I just drag over here and click this red line or this blue line around it, it's just going to render just inside that red bit. So I can see that that's still really quite overblown. So let's turn these right down. So I'm going to try, so this is my key light, so I kind of want this one strong, so let's try 800 on that one and maybe 300 on this one, and I'll just re-render that little section. Okay, and then this this sphere, let's quickly just put a smart material, sorry, a redshift Arnold material on this one. So new material, Arnold. I might just rename it just so I don't get confused. So AI, I like to leave the AI, so that means Arnold, and just give it a name. And just for now, I'm just going to change its color just so it's obvious what's going on. So just give it a quick sort of orangey color, don't care. I'm going to override that with the material in a minute. So re-render that just this bit, and that seems to be working. It's probably, I'll re-render the whole thing, but it's probably a touch too bright still, but we can see that at least we're getting the scene working. And you can see by changing the shape of those lights, I'm getting some interesting reflection on the object. So we're getting the floor reflecting here, we're getting this big square from above it, and the two different shapes to create a little bit of variation. That's about what I want. probably not worth adjusting it too much further until I start tweaking my settings. So let's Control S and call that our starting point. Alright, so let's plug in our materials. So Hypershade is this little sphere next to your gear icon. And I want this one, the AI standard surface, so I'm just going to hold down the right mouse on it and Graph Network. And on this node, let's just rename it AI Floor. And I could go about plugging in my nodes by, and this is what you often do, is by clicking the actual channel that you want, for example the color, and you click this, and then you tell it to load a file. So I'll do it for this one, and then what it will do is it plugs in a file node, and then in the file node you have to go, okay, find the actual file I want, and because it's a project it's going straight to it. So this is my floor, yep. Find the base color for the floor, no, not the orange, the floor, and hit open. And so that's plugged the floor into the color. With the actual file that you load, by default it comes in as RGB, so red, green, blue, and for the color one, that's what you want. Just be aware that for every other one, you don't actually want to leave it as this. Once you've plugged it in, you'll be wanting to change this to a different color space. We'll be using raw, which is more accurate. It works better. And so this one, I do have color applied. I can turn on my checkers and see my scene. So I've got texture applied. I could re-render to see how that looks, but basically we've got our working scene. For the other textures, so there's two more, the metallicness, which I'm using for specular color, and the displacement map. Instead, I could do the same thing. I could just go into the specular color and load in a file, but a nice way to do it that's a little bit quicker is to click and drag. So what I can actually do is say, I've got my floor height map and my floor metallic map. I'm going to click and drag these into my Hypershade. And when I do that, it automatically creates that little network and it names it based on the file, whereas here it's just called file 1. So it's a lot easier at a glance to see if you have file 1, file 2, file 3, it gets a bit confusing, whereas this is really clear. That's a nice way to do it. So for the metallic floor, actually let's render as we go. So currently these aren't plugged in. These are just floating there doing nothing. All I've done is plug in my color texture. And so if we do a quick render of what we've got so far, what we should see, is that rendering? Yep, what we should see is just a very flat image of the floor. So we're seeing the color, but we're not seeing any depth, and we're not seeing any, it's all very dull, we're not seeing any shininess. And what we really want is darkness in those holes and shininess on the top. So the specular color will give us control over that rather than making everything shiny or everything flat. So far what we've been doing, learning 3D, is just jumping into a shader and coming into the specular and just moving the roughness slider, so you can see this is all shiny, and I could move it this way and that goes really flat, or I could move it this way and that goes super shiny and reflective. But that's really not what we want in most cases. In this case we want control over it. Bits are shiny, other bits are dark. So I'm just going to save this image so we can compare. So I click on save, and then a little slider appears, and so you always see the first one is the latest render, but when you slide down it shows you the saved image that's in memory, which at the moment is the same as my last render. So now what I'll do is plug in the metallic one. So here's that floor metallic I've applied. We'll just go to output into specular color. It only gives you an option into what can accept this bitmap. So specular color. Now remember I said you have to change the color space. If I click on the file, our color space by default is set to RGB. So I click on the file that we've just brought in for the metallicness, and color space is set to RGB. What I want to do is change this to raw, and also turn on alpha is luminance. It creates a little bit of, it basically makes it work the way it's meant to. So let's take a look and see if there's a difference. So I'll hit render again. So really all we're seeing is, it's not super noticeable at all, is it? We're seeing this shine at the foreground, which is catching the light that's closer to the camera, is here it's catching the light, and then once we've applied the metallic map, it's a bit more consistent across the piece. If I orbit this and choose different angles, it's probably going to be a bit noticeable that we have darker spots in here. But it's a pretty subtle effect. It'll probably work a bit more noticeably on the orange. Now the final map is our height map. So this is a grayscale map. That's basically what it does is it creates new geometry. So when we set it up, it will tell Arnold at render time to subdivide our model, and based on the grayscale, so the darker it is, the less effect it has, and the brighter it is, the more effect it has. It'll push the geometry one way or the other. Hardly push it all or dramatically push it out. Now the way height maps work is like I said before, they're plugged into the displacement shader. So a height map is a displacement map. So this one I'm just going to move over to this side, and I'd like to just bring it out here so I can plug it in this way. And there's a few things we need to do to make this work. So firstly, the height map itself, just looking at my settings, I'm probably going to want to drop, considering I might need to drop the color gain. I'll leave it for now though. So under this setting here, you can see we've got the height map coming in to this displacement shader. And what you need to do is the actual geometry that it's applied to. So this floor, so this is the shader that we've just been looking at, but the actual geometry shader, you need to come into the Arnold setting and tell it to change the geometry when it renders. So at the moment it basically won't do anything if I render. If I open up this geometry tab, Arnold, and what we're looking at to do is come into our subdivision setting. So in other words, at the moment it's one plane. What we want to do is subdivide it. So you tell it what type of subdivision to do, and the Cutman-Clark preset is really good. One iteration is just going to do it turn it into 4 squares. So we want 2 iterations will turn it into 8 squares. 3 iterations should turn it into 16. So I'm going to crank it right up because it's pretty low detailed, but that'll be enough. What else do I want? Displacement. Yeah, so there's a height setting that we can drop, and I will drop that to, I'm just going to start by 0.05 and just see how we go with that. And also auto bump, so turn on that. Let's take a look at what we've got. I'll save this image so we can compare again. So now we can see the 2 images that we've saved to memory. It's just color, that's color plus metallicness, and this will be metallicness, color, and displacement. And so now that metallicness, now that we're getting displacement, the metallicness is really coming to the forefront. We're really seeing the effect of that shine from that texture map, which is probably cranked up too much. It's giving it a real plasticky look. The displacement is also cranked up a bit much, but it's very clear that this is doing something quite different to this. And because it's cranked up so much, it's really popping quite high. So let's just come back to that. 0.01. I'm just going to try render just this little frame so I don't have to re-render the whole thing. And you can see that's a lot more subtle. That's probably a bit closer to what we want actually. You need to be really careful with height maps, especially in Maya. It's one of those things where the settings in Maya are at full strength. It's just way too powerful. It's a really subtle effect, and that's all you want. It's just this subtle little bumpiness. But you can see straight away, it gives me the impression, it creates the impression of there's being actual geometry there, like there's actual floorboards and whatever is underneath the floorboard, and you're seeing little cracks in the tiles. and that looks a lot more realistic than that, which is just completely flat. So it's quite a powerful effect. Definitely worth experimenting with, and it's mainly an environment thing. It's really useful for these sorts of environments. It's also useful for, like we'll see on the surface of the skin of the orange, but in a similar way, it's really useful for characters. When you do that down the track, if you want a character with like gritty, pores of the skin and real obvious and whatever scratches and stuff, this is a really useful trick for doing that. So there's that floor, we'll call that done, and incremental save. And let's do the orange. So I've got a shader called Orange 01, so we'll go back to our hypershade. Again, there's this button here, and I want to see my orange, so I'll hold down the right mouse, graph network, and for this one I'm just going to drag all three of those textures in. So it's these three. Now just be careful, if you put nodes in and they're not connected to anything, if you do the graph network trick, it'll just drop those nodes. So you don't want to do that until you're ready to connect it all up. So, same thing. I'm putting the color, so just making sure that you can see what by dragging it in, it's really useful that I've got a nice name. I can just clearly see that's the color. So that goes into color, that goes into specular color, that goes into displacement. Quick and easy. This one I want to set to raw, alpha is luminance, and this one, same thing. The color you can leave, and the orange, so we can see now we've got the texture appearing. It's a big splotchy texture. It's going to need a little work to make it look good, but we'll get there. And the displacement, so let's, same thing, so redshift, Arnold, subdivision, Catman Clark, give it a bunch of subdivides, probably 5 or 6 is all you need. Let's try, just because it worked on the last one, let's try 0.001. I might go 3, just a little bit stronger, and enables auto divide. Again, I'm going to warn you, this won't look great because the orange splotches that we painted or were previously outside of the tutorial were made in Photoshop are far too large. But that's on purpose. There's a trick I want to show you on how to adjust that sort of stuff. Okay, so the metallicness is pretty good. That's a nice amount of shine for an orange. Maybe a touch strong, but it's not too bad. And I like that the dark spots, it's not very shiny at all. The displacement's barely working though, so let's try 0.05, so a lot stronger. And I don't want to have to re-render the whole thing, so just drag over it and click that little square. Just render that, because I'm adjusting the settings. I don't need to wait for however that long. It's like 7 seconds of my life I'll never get back. Now, I'm not concerned about that this doesn't look like an orange yet, because like I said, I need to adjust the size of these splotches. What I'm concerned about is that I'm actually seeing nice dramatic holes in it, and I'm seeing that little surface detail. So basically my displacement map's working correctly. I may want to push it a little bit stronger or a little bit weaker later, but for now I just want to make sure I can actually see it. But how do we fix up these splotches? Well, what we can do is adjust the way it's tiling. So in my displacement texture, sorry, my place 2D texture. So this is the file that we brought in. It's the orange. All it does is point to where the orange is, and it tells Maya what sort of color space to render it in, how to draw it basically. This one next to it, which is automatically created when it makes this node, tells it how to tile the object. And it does this in this repeat UV section. So if I were to type in, let's go like 50 in the U, you'll see in my thumbnail, it's repeating 50 times instead of once, and it's repeating over and over and making all these loops. And so, because I've done this before from experimenting, I know that if you set it to about 4, and you don't want just the 1, so it's stretching horizontally by 4, and now I also want it vertically by 4, so UV, and that's now looping the same amount. All it's done is repeated that pattern. But the catch is I don't want just that color to repeat like that. I want the metal and the diffuse to repeat like that. So for each one, I'm just going to hit 4 by 4 for all 3 of those textures. And so it could be, if you're not sure about the number, if you have to experiment to find the right number, maybe just unplug these textures. You can unplug a texture at any time, a node, just by clicking on this and dragging it out. So it's still there, nothing's happened, it's just that it won't render this color. And then when I want it back, just drag that out color back into the specular color. And so what you could do is just experiment with just this one, try it 10 by 10 there, too strong, try it 1 by 1 and 3 by 3, 4 by 4 until you get the right setting. Once you got the right setting, then just apply that to each other one. So let's see what we've got. So I've obviously cheated by previously working out that 4 by 4 seems to be about the right resolution, right number of repeats. Cool. So that displacement is definitely too strong, but it wasn't worth mucking around with until I can see this. So now the number of repeats is about right, but let's just tweak that displacement setting. So I just want to select the orange. So this displacement setting is how much it's subdividing and how strong it is the height map is pushing it on the geometry when it subdivides at render time. So I'll come down to this setting and maybe 0.0, let's try 2, just experimenting. Again, just re-render that little bit, don't need to re-render the whole thing. And that's, yeah, I'm okay with that. So let's re-render the whole thing and see if we're getting there. And assuming that is sufficient, there's only one more step that I want to do. Yep, cool. So that's definitely starting to look like an orange. It's on the right track. Of course, if you actually modeled it to be a bit more like an orange, if you had it's got a little divot at the top and bottom and usually a little bit of a stem coming out, it'll be far more realistic. But just the fact that the UV of a sphere causes it to pinch at the top helps it give it a little bit of an orange scent. But it's a quick demo to show you how materials work more than anything. And this is a really good example of the surface of this orange skin is really reflective, while the divots it's only reflecting as it goes in, and then down the bottom there it's hardly reflecting at all. So that metallic map is really doing its job. I could keep tweaking if I want to. If I decide that they probably are a little bit too much. I'm just going to set it to 0.1, but I won't re-render. I'll come back to that. What I want to do, I'll just save this image, is now it's a perfect sphere. So what I'd like to do is just get a little bit of bumpiness to make it more like as an orange slowly dies and rots, it loses its moisture and it becomes very sort of bumpy all over it. So the bump map is what I'll do to create that, to make it less spherical. So I'm not making a new texture, like a new texture map. I'm just creating a texture using an existing node. And so what I'll do is there's a couple of ways I could go about doing it, but you're plugging it into the normal camera down here. Just to show you, under geometry you have this option for bump mapping. So I could just plug it in here, which would work, but actually, yeah, let's do it that way. Now, instead of a file, like I said, I haven't got a bump map file. What I want to do is use noise. Here it is, noise, so that's just the Maya node. And that's a nice way to do it, actually, because that automatically connects it to that shading network. It gives me everything I want. The other way I could have done it is just in your empty space in your hypershade, you can hit tab and it brings up a search. And I could say, well, I know I want noise, and there it is, noise texture, and it just creates that node. But then what I would need to do is also create a bump 2D texture plug it in, and then plug that bump texture into this. So just by clicking this one is probably quicker. The issue is I had to know, or had to dig around to find this bump mapping, and I knew that it was under geometry, but if you didn't know that, you're like, where the hell's the normal camera? Like, it's not obvious looking at this where it is. But that's what documentation's for. Quick Google, you could figure out, or you can just keep digging until you see it there. Okay, so I've got a bump map, and looking at our thumbnail, yowza, that's ridiculously powerful. So it's really overblown. We don't need anywhere near that strength. So instead of this is the bump 2D node that it's created when I said make a bump map. It's set to 1, which is overblown. I'm going to try 0.05, and you can see a really subtle bump on that. I'm just experimenting, but let's try 0.1. That's cool. I want it to be strong enough so it's obvious what it's doing. So it's going to start looking like a bit like rotten fruit. So I might go 0.1, 0.15 maybe. Doesn't matter. 0.1, as long as we can see it. There's a very subtle effect going on there. The other thing is, when I click on this noise, you can see the pattern it's generating. This is just a filter, basically, like an algorithm, like a filter in Photoshop. It's like the noise in Photoshop. It's just generated by an algorithm to make these splotches, black and white splotches all over the place. And you can play with these settings to get it to behave the way you want. What I found is that by, I thought there was a blur setting. Which one was it? One of these, maybe it was it ratio? Yeah. So I'm just looking at this little thumbnail, but when I move that ratio down, it goes from pretty fine, small detail to pretty large, bloppy detail. And that's actually more what I want. I want these big, blobby distortions in the model rather than small little details. So that's all plugged in. Let's take a look to see if it works. So we'll just re-render the whole thing. So I've saved, this is the last save I've got. So re-render. Whoa, that's pretty strong. It's nice to see that it is working. It's always good to, when you apply something, you can actually see the effect happening, because then it's just a matter of adjusting the effects. What I find annoying is when you do a render and you can't even tell if it's working, and so you're better off, even though it looks horrible at this stage, you're better off seeing the result rather than not seeing any result. So a couple of things. Let's finish rendering. Yeah, I want to firstly turn down the strength of the bump a bit, because that's really strong still. So my bump depth, basing it just on the thumbnail is kind of hard. So we'll try that first, 0.02, and we'll just do a quick little render of that bit. Yeah, much better. And the other thing is my noise map needs a bit of tweaking. So I've just got a few little sharp lines that I'm not happy with. Honestly, this is trial and error. So what I would do now is start moving these sliders in this noise map until I start to get a nice result. So I'm looking at that to get a general feel for it. Probably don't need to. That's better. So turning down the amplitude, maybe. It's not quite so ridiculous. No, don't want too much noise. That gives it a little bit sort of more of a blur kind of feel. Let's see what we've got. Cool. So it's a pretty subtle effect, that bump, but you can sort of make out little areas where it's getting small amounts of bump here and there. Like clearly up here, we're getting bits that are pushed in. This is pushed out a little bit. I've probably gone a bit too subtle on that. I would probably push it a little bit further if I cared about it, but if I really cared about this, I would have spent a bit more time tweaking my metallic map inside of Materialize to get that less shiny, and at each stage I've kind of tried to rush over things in order to get the tutorial working, so this doesn't go for hours, but you can see the effect of it working. It's clearly doing its job. What I'd probably do now is remember it's a balance between what that noise map is doing and what the bump is doing. So I've probably turned that down because I've made this noise map a lot softer. I probably now need to increase this bump amount a touch, so maybe like 0.3 or even 0.4 or something like that. So it's worth that little bit of tweaking. And then really what you should do is consider your presentation. So I might just turn off snapping and let's save. Incremental save, so 03. So get in the habit of building up this collection of saves. You should never have one file or only a couple of files. Go nuts. The more files you have, the safer you are. So I'm going to Control D, and that seemed to be lagging a bit there. And let's make them slightly different size and random orientation. And make this guy quite a bit smaller. It's a little bubby orange. 3 is probably enough, or I could put one on top even, maybe make it bigger. That doesn't make sense. You wouldn't put the bigger one on top, would you? So, give a little bit of thought to how you present your work. And hopefully we're good for a final render. But yeah, that's it. That's understanding how to turn a picture, and that could be a picture that you've taken a photo in the street of something. So you could use your phone and take a photo of an interesting material, like say you're doing a floor and it's carpeted. Take a photo of carpet in your house, stick it into Materialize, generate a couple of maps, plug those into the appropriate channels inside of your renderer, and you can make some really nice looking effects without much work. That was an hour, but that was me slowly going through explaining each step, whereas once you understand that process, it's really quick and easy to just quickly plug in these materials. And this stuff's important going forwards because we'll be using Substance Painter, which will output a range of materials. So we'll be using our specular materials. Perhaps we'll be using a PBR, so the physics-based rendering workflow, and so that'll be using either a metallicness or a specular roughness map. And then there's all sorts of other texture maps that you'll start to see and experiment with to get the results that you want.